Our third presentation today will be on the outlook for biofuels by Dr. Aaron Smith. Dr. Smith is the Deloach Professor of Agriculture and Resource Economics at the University of California, Davis, where he has been since 2001. Originally from New Zealand, he earned his PhD in economics from the University of California, San Diego. His research addresses policy, trading, and price dynamics in agriculture, energy, and financial markets. He has over 40 publications in referee journals, including outlets such as the Review of Economics and Statistics, the Journal of Econometrics, and the American Journal of Agriculture Economics. His research has won the Quality of Communication, Quality of Research Discovery, and Outstanding American Journal of Agriculture Economics Award from the Agriculture and Applied Economics Association, and the Quality of Research Discovery Award from the European Association of Agriculture Economics. He is a co-director of the Center for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence Research. Thank you for being with us today, Aaron. I know it's early in the morning your time, but we appreciate you making time for us here in the Eastern time zone. At this time, I'll leave the program in your capable hands.
Thanks, Ben. It's not too early, and in fact, this is the first day where it's frozen overnight here, so it's actually not even that much warmer maybe here than it is where you are. I'm going to talk today about biofuels, and biofuels is a topic that it's a big deal in agricultural policy. If we just look back to last month during the political campaigns, we had a hearing for a new justice on the Supreme Court where Senator Joni Ernst asked questions about biofuels in cases that were working their way through the court system. We had candidate Joe Biden discussing renewable natural gas from manure digesters during a presidential debate. We had Donald Trump touting ethanol during various campaign rallies. This is a topic that at the highest levels of politics, people are bringing up repeatedly. It's a big deal. But it's a big deal outside of the Farm Bill. Often when we think about agricultural policy, a lot of it happens through the Farm Bill. The place where we see biofuels playing a big role is through the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard, which is a policy that was passed in 2007. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that policy because it's endlessly interesting for researchers and perhaps endlessly frustrating for those who are trying to run their businesses underneath it. Under that policy, corn now provides about 10% of the gasoline that we use in our cars in the United States. Soybeans provide significant portion of the diesel fuel that we use through biodiesel. And that program, if we just look at the amount of subsidy that flows from petroleum towards biofuels under that policy, it's about $10 billion a year. I see this as sort of middle of the most recent decade. In recent years, that subsidy's been a little bit lower because the credit prices, the RIN prices have been a little bit lower. But it's a big policy. On top of that, we have also biodiesel tax credit, which is huge in the biodiesel industry. That policy famously expires often and then is reinstated eventually by Congress and often is reinstated retroactively. So as of December 2019, there is a $1 tax credit for blending of biodiesel, and that is now in place until at least 2022. The Farm Bill itself has an energy title that includes, I'll say, about $100 million a year. And most of that money goes towards promoting biofuels production and research. Often the bill as written contains significantly more money, but much less than that is actually appropriated by Congress. There are also state policies that sit on top of the federal policy. I won't talk too much about those. I'll talk a little bit about perhaps the main policies, which are low carbon fuel standards in California and in Oregon, and such policies have been proposed in several other states, not Ohio to my knowledge, but certainly multiple other states. So you can go back a long way if you want to think about biofuels, and I like to start the story back in the 1920s. So coming out of the First World War, European agricultural production was recovering, so we had a big increase in global production of agricultural products, grains in particular. And so with that, grain prices were low. And so we were in a position where you're looking around and saying, well, what can we do with all these agricultural products that we're producing in the United States? Prices are low, farmers are not making money. It seems like we need some outlet. And around that same time, there were huge worries that we were about to run out of oil. The oil fields in Pennsylvania were starting to dry up. Oil in the West had not yet been discovered. And so people were really worried we're going to run out of oil. So it seemed like a perfect match. We have a whole bunch of crops lying around that we could potentially make into ethanol, alcohol, and use to fuel vehicles. What happened then was discovery of oil in Texas and in other parts of the West, so that oil became much, much cheaper as an energy source than ethanol. And we really didn't talk much about biofuels until the late 1970s when the oil crisis occurred. And again, it became a topic, both from a perspective of cost. Oil prices were very high during that period, and from a perspective of energy security, worries about whether we should be producing more of our fuel domestically rather than importing it. So before sort of digging maybe a little bit more into the policy, I want to give just a little bit of a background of what we mean when we talk about biofuels. I think most of us focus on ethanol for good reason. That's by volume the largest portion of biofuels. Ethanol is alcohol distilled from, in the United States, almost exclusively corn. In other parts of the world, such as in Brazil, it's distilled from sugarcane. Ethanol is blended seamlessly with gasoline up to 10% concentration. Once you try to increase that blend rate above 10%, you run into multiple barriers. A third of US corn now is used to make ethanol. So as we all know, it's a big policy. Some of that corn comes back out, the back end of about a third of it comes back out as distillers grains, so feed for animals. So on net, about a quarter of US corn is used in our cars. And corn ethanol gives a reduction in carbon emissions relative to fossil gasoline, but I would say not a huge reduction. And there's widely varying estimates of how big that reduction is, depending on which types of things you try to take account of in the life cycle of producing the fuel. It's also true that you can produce ethanol in cleaner ways. For example, instead of using fossil natural gas in your ethanol plant, if you're using renewable natural gas in your ethanol plant, that's going to reduce the carbon emissions through the corn ethanol process. So there's a range of reductions that you get from using corn ethanol relative to gasoline, but it's not a huge reduction that you would get from perhaps some other kinds of fuels. Cellulosic ethanol, this is biofuel made from the inedible parts of plants. So corn stover, wood, grasses, much lower emissions than conventional ethanol, in large part because those are products that we were going to be producing anyway. They're there. And if we can then use them to try to replace fossil fuel, we get a huge reduction in carbon emissions. Cellulosic ethanol, as we'll see, expensive, not really yet commercially viable. Biodiesel, biodiesel made typically from vegetable oils such as soybean oil or animal fats, and also including used cooking oil, which has become a larger and larger component of biodiesel production recently. You can blend biodiesel with petroleum diesel, certainly up to 5%. And it typically, estimates say it has lower emissions than conventional ethanol. Drop-in biofuels. So these are produced from a different chemical process from, say, vegetable oils, animal fats, chemically similar to a petroleum product. And what that means is you can literally drop that fuel into the petroleum without having to worry about chemical issues associated with blending. And so in California now, 15% of diesel is drop-in renewable diesel, much of that from used cooking oil, but also from other feedstocks, including soybeans. And so the scope to increase the amount of biofuels is greater if you can produce renewable diesel. Renewable gasoline, there's very little of it. It's relatively expensive to produce. Renewable diesel is becoming more and more common, especially under the various policies that we have. The last one, biogas. So this potentially can give large reductions in greenhouse gas emissions because not only do you prevent the methane that is coming, for example, particularly from animals, from cattle, but also from landfills. You prevent that methane from going into the atmosphere where it is a greenhouse gas. You take it and then you put it into a pipe and you use it instead of fossil natural gas. And so there potentially you save even more carbon emissions. And so, so renewable natural gas is expensive. There is some of it, particularly in California, under the low carbon fuel standard, but it's an expensive technology typically, so there's not a huge amount of it yet. So with that background, the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard, it became law in 2007. It mandated volumes of biofuel for various fuel types. And the various types are defined based on the greenhouse gas emissions reduction that is estimated. So what's shown here in this yellow circle is anything that will get you at least a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Think of that yellow as mostly corn ethanol. The blue is stuff that gets you potentially more greenhouse gas reductions than you would get from corn ethanol, up 40% or more reduction. Think of that blue as indicating as being, say, sugarcane ethanol that might come from Brazil. Then on top of that, we have biodiesel. You notice the red dot for biodiesel is inside the blue one. So biodiesel can count towards the advanced mandate, but biodiesel is, again, more than a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions related to relative to fossil diesel. And then finally, we have the cellulosic mandate. So this is for the second generation biofuels that are much, much cleaner in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And those are also a part of this policy. What this plot shows us is how the mandate, so this is what's written into the law and the Renewable Fuel Standard, how the mandated volumes are supposed to change over time. And so what we see is that in the first few years, up until say 2012, 13, 14, we were looking at most of the biofuels were going to come from corn ethanol, essentially. And then that was going to cap out at 15 billion gallons per year. And then we were going to see potentially a lot more of the cleaner stuff, the cellulosic in particular. So what has actually happened? So what I'm showing here is I'm showing the black line is 10% of gasoline. The red line is how much ethanol we have used in the United States. And so what you can see is from 2007, 8, 9 up to 2010, we were increasing the amount of ethanol that we were using. And then we hit that black line known as the blend wall. That's 10% of the gasoline blend. And essentially for the last 10 years, we've basically been stuck at 10%. You can see that it's maybe eked just over the line. There's a little bit more high blend ethanol fuel now being sold in the market. But for the most part, we're stuck at, for most of the nation, we're stuck at 10%. So how do these volumes compare to what the law says we were supposed to use? What the law says we were supposed to use, you can see around 2013, we were supposed to be using more corn ethanol under the policy than we actually are. We were also around that time, we're supposed to start using cellulosic. What's actually happened, if we jump forward, is we've seen essentially none of the green stuff. And we've sort of been muddling along in this policy for the last 7 or 8 years, sort of stuck between this rock and a hard place where on the one hand, we have a law that says we need to eke the corn ethanol a little bit higher. So it's above, so it's up to 15 billion gallons and it's a little bit above that 10% blend wall. And so we have a legislation that's saying we need to do that. We have an industry that's saying that's really expensive for us to do. We can't really do it. And we have the EPA kind of stuck in the middle. So talking of the EPA, EPA has been, as I said, sort of stuck in the middle here, I would say, as it tries to sort of mediate how to run this policy. And EPA has, and one reason EPA is stuck in the middle is it has some flexibility. Each year, EPA is supposed to determine the percent of transportation fuel that would be needed in order to meet the mandate. So it looks at the renewable fuel standard, and the renewable fuel standard says 15 billion gallons of conventional ethanol. And it says, okay, 15 billion gallons of conventional ethanol. We predict 150 billion gallons of gasoline is going to be used next year. That means we need 10% of every gallon to be ethanol. And so they say next year, 10% is the number you have to hit. And what happened during this period where we were stuck against the blend wall is in 2014-15, EPA failed to make a rule at all. It just didn't declare a rule. In 2017 through 19, under the Trump administration, what EPA has done is effectively reduced the mandate down to or below the bland wall by giving exemptions to small, relatively small refineries from RFS compliance. So what that means is that it reduced the amount of biofuel that it needed to be blended. And this is now, as with all of these decisions by EPA, they're working their way through the courts, and there's going to be arguments about these for months and years to come. However, through it all, I think it's important for us to remember that gasoline blend has remained at about 10% ethanol, right? We hit that blend wall, we couldn't really go above it, also haven't dropped down way below it. Ethanol use has exceeded in the last 4 years, 14.3 billion gallons. It's pretty close to the 15 billion that you would expect under the actual mandate as legislated. So in some ways you say the policy is not that far away from where it's supposed to be on the corn ethanol side. On the cellulosic side, I would say it's failed. So has the renewable fuel standard been successful? There are 3 objectives, and you can even go back, say, to look at George W. Bush's speech that he gave, for example, when signing this bill, and it lists 3 objectives. He talks about energy independence, he talks about climate change mitigation, and also talks about sort of enhancing and building demand for agricultural products, and I've shortened that here to say sort of to increase corn demand. And it's no doubt, if we look at the numbers, and there's any one of many figures I could have put up to illustrate this, but in 2007, around when the renewable fuel standard started, we saw corn prices increase, and they've essentially stayed up, right? We used to have $2 corn, now we have $4 corn. There's a lot of other things that happened in between, so it's not all the increase in demand from biofuels by any means, but the fact that we've gone from 5 to 10% of the corn supply being used to make ethanol to 25% of it being used to make ethanol, that's an increase in demand for corn. That's led to an increase in prices. That's led to an increase in acreage, and you can see it here when you say, in the 15 years before the renewable fuel standard, we were growing about 70 million acres of corn in the United States. Since the renewable fuel standard started, it's been more like 82, 83, 84 million acres per year. So that increase in acres, a lot of that has come from the renewable fuel standard. So if from the perspective of corn, you would say this policy has been successful for the most part in achieving its objective. Energy independence, that's not something I've talked a whole lot out of, and I would say, has the policy been successful? On the one hand, yes, we're producing more energy domestically. On the other hand, it's not just ethanol. In fact, we're producing a lot more energy domestically through fracking. So you can see this graph here from the Energy Information Administration. The light blue shows us natural gas. Natural gas production in the United States has increased a lot, and conversely, coal has gone down. So the largest reason that we've seen coal use go down over time is because natural gas has become cheaper because of the fracking technology. If you look closely, you can see that the green area of renewables has gotten a little bit bigger. Some of that is renewables from electricity. Some of that also is renewables such as biofuels in the transportation sector. But really, if you want to talk about sort of the big story about energy independence in the United States over the last 10 to 15 years, it's fracking. Finally, on climate change mitigation, I'd say the policy's been, for the most part, a failure. It has, and you can see this also with environmental groups now, have sort of moved away from support for the renewable fuel standard, in large part because we haven't got that promised sort of second generation, much cleaner biofuel that was hoped. It's just turned out to be too expensive to actually, so far at least, put into practice. So what next? 2 slides here. The first is when we sort of think pragmatically, the volumes in the renewable fuel standard, and you might have noticed that all of my graphs kind of end at 2022. When you look at the statute, it specifies volumes up to 2022. After that, EPA essentially is going to make the new rules in coordination with the DOE. So what I've written here is paraphrased out of the statute. And what EPA is tasked to do is to look at the impact on the environment, energy security, expected future production, impact on infrastructure, impact on cost to consumers, and then other social and economic factors. So what you can see here is that there's a lot of scope for EPA to make different decisions here about where the renewable fuel standard goes from this point. It's hard to see that whatever, so I would say whatever EPA does, it's really hard to see us going below 10% ethanol blend in gasoline unless there's a really big change in oil prices relative to corn prices. That seems like the industry is set up to deliver gasoline that has 10% ethanol, and that's going to continue whatever the policy is. But beyond that, there's a lot of scope for what's going to happen in this reset. And you know, they're supposed to do this about 14 months before the beginning of 2022. So we're looking about a year from now. If EPA is able to stay on time, we would expect to see some idea about which direction that the renewable fuel standard is likely to go. So to sum up and to think sort of the future, there's a lot of politics here involved in biofuel policy, as was implied by the first slide I had about various politician comments on the topic recently. And I have no way of making political predictions, and I don't know that really any of us do. It does seem likely, however, that electric vehicles will become the dominant technology eventually. And I don't know when eventually is. We have a recent executive order from California that new vehicles in the state will be all zero emission vehicles, which practically means electric vehicles beginning in 2035. That's a lofty goal that they may or may not be able to achieve, but it kind of gives us an idea of maybe where the technology is going. And if you look ahead 10, 20, 30 years, probably most of the cars on the road will be electric vehicles. There'll still be a role for fossil fuels, perhaps in aviation and other areas, but it does mean that the market for biofuels and transportation is not sort of as big as the liquid fuel market is right now. It is going to be smaller. So I think it's important to realize that, but also to realize that markets for agricultural products come and go. So, you know, we've had this boom in particular in corn, but also to a lesser extent in soybeans from biofuels, and that's going to continue for a while. And then other things will come along, and including the things that we heard about in the first presentation, where one way to be able to reduce carbon emissions coming out of agriculture is going to be for various sort of farm level activities. And maybe that's going to be a direction that these kinds of policies go rather than you know, purely on the production side. So, so I'm always optimistic about the farm economy. I grew up in New Zealand, and I'll finish with this, where when I was 9 years old, I had sort of spent my first 9 years in an environment where the government basically paid my dad to own sheep. And then the government, a new government was elected, and they said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. And it was hard for agriculture, but agriculture has continued to thrive. Farmers have continued to be successful. That's not to say it wasn't a painful process, this transition, but my only point is that there's always going to be demand for agriculture. There's going to be innovative people looking to participate in the industry. And so I don't see, no matter what happens on biofuel policy, you know, I think there's always lots of interesting opportunities in agriculture.
Well, great. Thank you, Aaron. We really appreciate your time today and your presentation. We do have 2 quick questions. I'll ask you real quick before we move on to our final panel of the day. But first question is, what are your thoughts on increases in corn demand against a price, you know, the drop in corn price? For instance, is there an inflection point given a 10% blend wall?
So I don't think there's an inflection point in sort of corn demand per se. You know, there's some scope perhaps for increased export markets of ethanol, and maybe that's going to be something that can compensate for reduce consumption in the United States. But I would say there's a lot of uses for American corn, and each of those uses have different elasticities, meaning that if you raise the price, some users will cut back a lot because they have a useful substitute. Other users will not cut back as much. So it does mean that sort of above the blend wall, right now, given the policy, that above the blend wall corn demand is a little more elastic because you're not going to below the blend wall you have to produce at least that much ethanol according to the policy. So that demand is pretty inelastic. There's maybe a little more elastic beyond that. But I think given that there's so many different uses for corn, those things all sort of aggregate out that I think in aggregate you don't really see a big inflection point.
Excellent, thank you. And then the final question real quick, how can we increase the demand for electricity without the use of fossil fuels?
So renewables, and I think, again, the first presentation, we had a good plot of what's happened to the prices of solar and wind in particular. The big barrier right now that still exists is a barrier in transportation for electric vehicles being widely adopted, and it's a barrier in electricity generation is batteries. So batteries have become much cheaper, much by an order of magnitude over the last 10 years, but they're still way too expensive. So if that technology trajectory continues, which lots of people smarter than me think is going to happen, to the point where batteries are cheap enough that they can account for the fact that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, and they can store the electricity that's generated, that's going to mean that electric cars become more viable and that renewable electricity generation becomes more viable. And so I think it's all about technology and not really a whole lot to do with policy. And I think the same thing is true of what we've seen with fracking and coal, to the extent that we've seen government policymakers looking to sort of make environmental policies that might reduce coal consumption. Those policies have just kind of been swept away by the massive reductions in costs through this change in technology. And I think that's the same thing that we're going to see here, is that as batteries become much less expensive, if that happens, that's going to be the thing that dominates and leads us to a lot of renewable electricity and a lot of electric vehicles.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you for being with us. We appreciate your time and joining us all the way out here in Ohio. So thank you. And if any of our attendees have any questions, we'll make sure to get those to you as well.